Most people don't know it yet. You might actually find that you already have an established food forest at your fingertips. So we'll show you on our property exactly what I'm talking about. What's going on, everyone? I'm Brandon, and this is the Greening the Desert Project. Over the winter and coming into spring here, it's been nice to be able to see a lot more growth happening, being able to identify more of the vegetation that we do have on our property, and basically coming to the realization that most of the things that are growing on our property here are edible and or medicinal in one form or another, be it the root system or the berries and the fruits. But we actually already have a food forest, technically speaking. But with us having a food forest already established in the area, what does make up our food forest that we already currently have? So everyone knows about the junipers and the red eastern cedars that we have, which are in the juniper family. So a lot of junipers as well as different shrubs and bushes, because all the bushes that we do have on our property, they all produce edible berries. So we can look to the natives that used to live in this area and see and kind of research about the things that they ate and what they grew a little bit and propagated. But more importantly, how they utilize the land in best practices as far as thriving with their culture in this kind of environment. We also have a shrub that's a barberry shrub that produces edible berries. We also have a bush that's called a skunk bush, which produces berries as well. But a lot of parts of both of these plants are actually medicinal and or edible. But the other tree that we do actually have is called the desert olive. So it probably produces a little bit more tart kind of olives, you could say, but it's something that is edible on our property. Technically speaking, you can eat the juniper berries, more so when we're looking at the natives and how they utilize the tree. They used a lot of the berries for seasoning on meats and such like that. But we can also make teas and other things with the bark as well as the needles for some of those antimicrobial, antibacterial, or intestinal problems that we do have. But I think it's something really overlooked in just this general niche of permaculture in general is observing the native surrounding vegetation that we do have, because we already have plenty of vegetation that can deal with the elements and the climate that we have here. So why not promote a lot more of the things that already are thriving? With the desert olive is a key factor, as well as the skunk bush. Both of those bushes are very easy to propagate. We can take a whole bunch of cuttings from those and actually soak those in water for probably about a month or so, and those will actually start getting little nubs for roots. And that's what we've done through the winter, is we've identified some of these bushes. We've taken a bunch of cuttings from them and stuck them in water. And now actually with some of the swales and some of the earthworks that we'll do around the terraces and such in that area, we'll actually add a lot of those propagated plants that are already from our property. So we have a whole abundance of these kinds of shrubs all around that we can utilize here and propagate even more so. And that's the benefit, I think, with the desert willow as well, is that tree is actually fire resistant, as well as contributing to erosion control. And that goes with the skunk bush and the barberry, I think, too. I mean, all of these plants, all the trees, everything we have here is contributing to the erosion control. But we can take some of the more easily propagatable plants and shrubs that we have here and diversify those, by the thousands basically, to really get a whole lot more vegetation growing in the least amount of time here. So that's the really cool part, I think, about our scenario, our unique situation and landscape that we have here, is when we actually observe and look around, we actually have a whole lot more beneficial vegetation here than what meets the eye. So that's where it does take the microscope, figuratively, of observing and looking a little bit deeper at our landscapes, what our landscapes consist of, what kind of vegetation we have, and doing a bit more homework on our area and what is thriving and growing, and what the other possibilities are for what we can grow here in the future more so too. It's really just an all-in-all win-win situation when we have this kind of vegetation on our property, because for one, we already have food production that's going on. Number two is we have easily propagated plants to be able to diversify around the property that are already adapted and able to thrive in the area. And number three is more cost reduction that we're incurring, because we're not having to pay for a whole bunch of trees or a whole bunch of shrubs and different bushes, because we already have the abundance here, and the abundance that can be multiplied by the thousands very easily and in a short amount of time. So it's also just a big bonus to know that we can actually propagate and have a regenerative source of fuel and wood source basically, but also more organic material that can be added to the soil to help build it up even further, because a lot of our bushes are deciduous, so they are dropping leaves, so we can create more leaf mulch, which equates to more fungal activity, which equates to more diversity in our area, which is what we want to promote with the microbiology and the microorganisms, but also with the vegetation and the diversity of plants, shrubs, trees, and bushes that we have here. And with just observing our vegetation, that's where we also can observe where a lot of these shrubs, bushes, and different trees that we want to take cuttings and propagate more, we can observe a whole lot more of the surroundings, how they're interacting, where they're growing, what maybe the soil conditions are, what kind of the surrounding conditions there are, or if there's any little microclimates that it has. Working with the native plants and our native old growth forest here is providing a tantamount of evidence and examples for us to follow, for us regreening this area and regreening the desert. So working with these native plants, it's going to give us the head start where already in the first year, we're already going to start getting food production, not only from our garden spaces that we've created and started planting in, but also from our surrounding area in general, as we're able to identify more and more plants that we have on the property, as more stuff starts growing and we're able to identify it and able to propagate it more as well. But that's where we can observe and figure out and understand how to propagate and what to propagate, as well as where to place it and where best we can utilize it. So nature can be almost like a little Lego set where it's spilled out all of its pieces and made a huge mess and lost the instruction manual. And we're here basically to organize everything in the best way that we can, in the most efficient way that we can, but also creating more abundance, but more fertility, and promoting more of the nature that we have. So we had arranged our garden beds a few months ago during the wintertime, and we've had everything able to settle and get established. And Nika has actually done a really nice job with all the rock mulching for the pathway, and then also with the garden beds themselves. So these are technically raised garden beds. So we still have a few other things to do with the garden beds before we start planting everything. And we actually have our bokashi ferments that we had created over a month ago. So we have the ferments ready to go inside the garden beds, and then we also have a bin of worm castings as well as red wiggler worms that we've been cultivating and farming through the winter. So we'll be coming at our garden beds with a lot of biology, the ferments that we've created, but we also have dry amendments that have biology in them as well, but also some nutrients to help feed the microbes. So we'll be utilizing all the different tools that we're bringing. But we've had our plants since last year, and we've been growing them out. More so, Nika has been keeping a watch on them all winter and making sure everything survives. So we've had a pretty good deal of success with what survived through the winter. And so we've got a good variety of different plants, including fruits and vegetables. But the way we're going to be cultivating our permaculture garden and our future gardens as well is that we're going to be pretty much how Nika likes to term chaos gardening. Just clumping as much biomass and plants as possible. So with the chaos gardening, we're pretty much not really concerned about all of the different methods with companion planting and proper just plant placement, because in nature, everything is really just kind of scattered around. There's interactions between plants that do happen, but when it comes to nature and natural growth, there's really no separation and everything just grows together. There's no competition. We're gonna plant as densely as we can in the garden spaces just to maximize the coverage, but then we'll also be implementing cover crops as well to help fill in some of the gaps and help create more biomass, but also add more nitrogen with the legumes, as well as pulling phosphorus out of the ground with the wheat that we have, and just creating more biomass in the garden and organic material for the microbiology to feed on. So we are starting out a little bit different than how most people start. When most people get started, they don't have as many plants or really a garden bed or anything quite established yet. So our situation's a bit different because we've already had our experience in Montana, so we have a pretty good idea of the stuff we want to plant that we've already acquired and had bare roots of, and plants that we know that'll just work in our area in general. So looking back at how we created our garden beds, we actually utilized a lot of the soil that was already underneath this tree. And since we are cutting this tree down pretty much completely, we might utilize part of the tree as like a support post or for hanging stuff or a shelf or something. But we've utilized the soil from the tree and pretty much built up these garden beds with that soil. But then from now on, we'll be building up our own soil with all of the vegetation, the strawberries, the grasses that will be growing. So everything in here will help contribute to the fertility of the garden beds. So Nika has already started digging out some of the pits that we'll need for burying our ferments. And the big difference with how we do ferments is adding the liquid with the bokashi buckets. So we have a double whammy feature to these ferments. So part of the buckets is we have the remaining solids that we'll be able to bury, and then we'll add the worms and the worm castings so that we're adding nutrients, but then we're adding also the worms for breaking down the rest of those solids from the ferment buckets. So we'll utilize the liquids for spraying around the property, spraying the beds. We'll be trying to get as much biology into our area, our garden beds. We'll create the diversity that will create the workforce to break down as much of the organic material, the silts, the sands, the clays, the rocks and pebbles, all that stuff. We need as many workers as we can to help restore this desert. I want to give a special thanks to our Green Guardian YouTube and Patreon members. We really appreciate your guys' support and joining us in the journey of greening the desert. You can support the Greening the Desert project by joining our Green Guardians membership page on Patreon. Otherwise, we have our newest Green Guardian membership here on YouTube that you can also join. So we'll be working not only with the biology that's already naturally occurring in the soil itself, but we'll be adding our own microorganisms as well through the dry amendments that we have, the compost that we've also created, as well as the ferments and the worm castings. So now we're on the other side, opposite side of the first garden bed that we were starting and getting everything transplanted. But that amount of garden bed space isn't enough for all the plants that we do have. So we have a few more plants that we need to plant up front here. So we actually had lined out this contour on level line during the winter time. We'll kind of come back through here and we'll continue stacking the rocks up so that we make a really nice terraced area, just like we did for the tent site. But in this case, we have this whole area to kind of plan out. So we want to do a few infiltration basins over in this area, along with a couple swales, I think. So we'll get everything situated for the terrace so that when we dig the basins and the other swales, we'll have some of that material to start building up this terrace and actually start building up the soil. So that's why we have the cardboard and the straw, as well as the compost and the bokashi ferments that we'll be using to basically build this bed up from scratch and create a really nice healthy soil mix that we can grow plants in this year and then continue that process for years to come. We do have really sandy soil on this south side of the property, so we need a lot of carbon material. So we need a lot of material that will help make this soil a bit more spongy and be able to hold the water a bit better. But then for the monsoon rains, we want to level off these terraces and make sure our swales are on contour and getting this area set up so that we have maximum water penetration and maximum water holding capacity. We've chosen this area for building the terraces as well as building more swales and infiltration basins because we have a fairly large area here that's really bare. It's all just sand and gravel and rocks. There's really not much vegetation going on. So this is a really good area that we can disturb without displacing too much at the same time. We'll have the materials for building up the terraces and a little bit of our swale that we'll get here, but we'll be planning things out a little bit more so that everything interacts with the first rainwater basin that we have just a little bit up the ways here, and also the other swales that we have up the way on the property. So part of the goal with a lot of the earthworks that we're doing here, we want most of our earthworks, if not all of them, to interact with each other and to act as one system altogether. So we want things to overflow to the next earthwork, to the next earthwork, and so on. And that way, we'll get way more saturation on the property itself. We'll be slowing a lot more water and hopefully penetrating and soaking a lot more water on our property. Why we chose this area for building terraces and doing more swales and basins was because we already, throughout the winter, we actually had rotated our goats in this area a few times just because it was bare. So with feeding them a lot of hay, they spread a lot of their manure, they stamped it in. At least for now, we've got all of the goat manure in this area and at least a little bit of the organic material from the hay to be able to scoop out from our basins and use those for the terracing. So that we'll be getting more nutrients, more bacteria, more microbiology and microorganisms to help break everything down further as we add compost and all the other material that we have. It's part of the planning of this whole Greening the Desert project that you'll see us kind of work in random spots, it almost seems like, but where the gabion wallopini is, I think that will kind of portray how we have our starting point with the gabion wallopini and how we are basically spreading out in a ripple effect with the earthworks and the water harvesting techniques that we'll be doing, along with our permaculture beds and planning out our permaculture food forests. And what makes this spot just really easy is that it doesn't have a huge downward incline to it. So we actually have a fairly flattish area. So it makes it actually a pretty good spot to dig out basins and dig out our swales, but also for our terracing. So it's at least at a steady pace because of the incline here. And because of the other earthworks that we have done up the way, we know at least a little bit that we'll be slowing a good majority of water that used to all rush down here all at once. So that's just part of the goal, is slowing, taking the energy out of the water and allowing it to soak more into the landscape, but as well as capturing as much water as we can. You'll notice how rocky it is on this side where we have the terracing, and that was a major component for making that decision of building this up as a terrace, because there is the abundance of rocks for one, and I think we're gonna be pretty hard pressed to dig a swale into this hillside. The rocks here are kind of like iceberg chunks a little bit, where a little bit's sticking up at the top, but then when you try and dig at it, it's just this huge monster underneath that's almost impossible to dig at. When we do a lot of these different earthworks in certain spots, there is a rhyme and reason, but it's also a little bit with our preference for how we want to design things and how we want it to look. But it's with the observation of certain areas, you know, like this spot in general, because there's all these rocks that we can use for building up, we could use for on the gabion wallopini or for any other projects. And so with that side being the terracing with all the rocks and being a bit harder to dig into, the benefit with this larger area is we're going to take advantage of being able to dig farther down rather than digging a shallow swale or even a rock check dam or a rock swale. You know, it's probably more in our benefit, in my opinion at least, and observing that it's probably better to take advantage of the fact that we can actually dig right here and probably dig down at a fairly good depth. So we might as well utilize more basin and rainwater harvesting basins as we can. Observation is the key point in permaculture and doing permaculture gardens or permaculture food forests, because we spent the whole winter observing our area, building on the gabion wallopini, but at the same time gathering the materials we need from certain areas, but also planning out a lot of these earthworks. But the key takeaway is always observation. So we've been able to observe a whole lot throughout the winter to plan where we're going to have certain garden beds and how we're going to interconnect all of our earthwork pieces. So it's just a sense of starting from one single point and rippling our way out with the earthworks and all of the permaculture techniques that we're doing here. And since we're talking about the gabion wallopini,